So when I first met Dr. Jesse McCarthy in 2010 or 2011, he was an incoming PhD student at Princeton, where I was then in my second year working on my PhD. And I remember there was something that set him apart from the rest of his cohort. It wasn't just that he was a little older. He graduated from Amherst College in 2006 and had spent a few years knocking about, whereas most of his peers had gone straight from undergrad to grad school, maybe with a gap year. And it wasn't just the worldliness with which he carried himself, which I later came to assume was a result of his transatlantic upbringing, growing up shuttling back and forth between the United States and France. No, there was something else, a seriousness in his demeanor that put him in a different milieu, even when he was joking around and drinking beers with everyone else. A few years later, I ran into him at a party at The Nation where he'd started writing literary criticism and commentary while still working on his dissertation. And I was pleased to see that Jesse was on the move. And he hasn't slowed down since. In addition to The Nation, Dr. McCarthy has been writing for N+1, Dissent, The New Republic, the New York Times Book Review, and The Point, where he is now also an editor. Several of these essays and reviews have gone into the remarkable and brilliant collection he's going to read from tonight, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, which just came out from Wright. But not only has Jesse been making his mark as a literary and cultural critic, he also defended his dissertation in 2018 and joined the faculty at Harvard University as an assistant professor of English and of African and African American studies, where his research and teaching is concerned with the intersection between politics and aesthetics in African American literature, post-war or post-45 literary history, and Black studies. His dissertation, The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War, 1945 to 1965, no doubt soon to be a book, argues for a reinterpretation of Black literary aesthetics in the early Cold War and for the value of a discrete periodization of that era. Dr. McCarthy also wrote the introduction to a new edition of Vincent O. Carter's long out-of-print memoir, The Bern Book, published by Dalkey Archive last year, and his first novel, The Fugitivities, is due out from Melville House this June, with starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, as well as a blurb from Namwali Serpell. I look forward to all that with great enthusiasm, but there's a lot to say right now about the collection of essays Dr. McCarthy's reading from tonight. His astonishing analyses, explorations, and juxtapositions, the powerful connections he so subtly draws between Goya and Kahinda Wiley, Walter Benjamin and Kara Walker, Sappho and Phyllis Wheatley, Baraka and Basquiat and Donald Trump and Lil Wayne, trap music and the War on Terror. But I think what I might appreciate most, and there is so much to appreciate here, is the careful lucidity of his argumentation. Jesse never goes for the easy quip, the broad brush, or the quick dismissal. He takes his time, and because his approach is not only insightful, but deeply humane, it is always time well spent. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to read one short paragraph from the book's title essay to help set the stage. Gil Scott-Heron has a beautiful song I wish Ta-Nehisi Coates and all of us would listen to again, writes Professor McCarthy. It's called Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul? The title is also the refrain, but the force of the rhetorical question lies in its pithy yoking of materialism and slave capitalism to a logic that transcends the material. This is also the crux of my dissent, he goes on. What can reparations mean when the damage cannot be accounted for in the only system of accounting that a society recognizes? Part of the work here is thinking about the value of human life differently. This becomes obvious when commentators, including Coates, get caught up trying to tabulate the extraordinary value of slaves held in bondage. Don't forget to convert to today's dollars. It shouldn't be so hard to see that doing so yields to a mentality that is itself at the root of slavery as an institution. Human beings cannot and should not be quantified, monetized, valued in dollar amounts. There can be no refund check for slavery. But that doesn't mean the question of injury evaporates, so let us ask a harder question. Who will pay reparations on my soul? Ladies and gentlemen, we're very lucky to be able to spend some time with Professor McCarthy tonight asking these questions at the beginning of what is already an astonishing career. I feel privileged to be able to say I knew him when, and I ask you to join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Dr. Jesse McCarthy. So, claps all around.
Thank you so much, Roy, for that very generous introduction. And I'm really, really glad to be here, to be with all of you, and to make this essentially one of the first stops on my what is sort of a virtual book tour for this collection of essays. And I'm particularly excited to be sharing this work in a forum where I, can expect that many of you are precisely the kinds of readers and the audience that I imagined for the book. That is to say, people who are interested in writing and creative writing and ideas in the worlds of art and culture, and who may be in the institution or outside of the institution, by which I mean the academy, but who are interested in trying to think through the very difficult moment that we find ourselves in, and to do so, at least from my perspective, in the realm in which I find myself and the competence that I have. That is to say, in the world of the arts, culture, letters, and ideas. I thought I would begin by just saying a few words about the context and sort of the origin story to some extent of the book, to kind of situate us. And then I wanted to read, I'll read a slightly abridged version of an essay called Venus and the Angel of History, which is one of the essays in this book, that I hope will give somewhat of a general flavor of the contents of the book, and which addresses, as all of the essays do in one fashion or another, sort of my main preoccupations. And one of the reasons I chose that is because I do have an accompanying PowerPoint slide for that, and I always think it's easier and you get less Zoom fatigue if you don't have to just be staring at my face the whole time. So I'll have some stuff to put up on the screen for that. But just to say a few words about the book, as Roy indicated, I really started writing for the public starting back in 2014. I was a graduate student at Princeton at the time, and like a lot of folks, I think I was, grappling with this kind of extraordinary insurgency and movement that we now sort of paraphrase under the Black Lives Matter movement, but which encompasses, I think, a wide range of forms of contestation of sort of both the politics of the present, the political economy of the present, and also noticing the ways in which culture has sort of been changing and shifting throughout this period, throughout the Obama years and then subsequently the Trump years. And, I think I felt as dedicated and compelling as scholarship is to me, and I do value it enormously. I felt a need to and a desire to think through these things in a forum that wasn't restricted to academic publishing and to journal articles. And I've always felt that within the African American literary tradition, especially the essay, has been this kind of privileged form for thinking through these problems and these questions. The late great Cheryl Wall, who very sadly and very unfortunately lost to COVID this past year. Her last book was a magnificent book dedicated to the study of the art of the African American essay, and I think a lot about that as sort of the tradition within which I'm working, and I think of it very much as a living tradition of which I'm just a small part. There are so many extraordinary writers, thinkers, and critics out there who are doing work right now, and in a sense, I'm sort of modestly wanting to join that conversation. And also, in the introduction, I say rather explicitly that the book is dedicated to the younger generations who are coming up right now, and I suppose I hope that in some fashion or another that the book is sort of addressed, especially to them as emblematic of, I think, many of the things that we're facing, and that I think we have the capacity to address, but also in a kind of formal sense that to encourage folks to embrace their creativity, embrace the freedom and the kind of experimental and innovative qualities that have always existed in the tradition. And in that sense and in that spirit, I do really mean these essays in the kind of, in Montaigne's sense of the attempt. These are all non-definitive takes. They're really more invitations to think with various objects of cultural inquiry, with various thinkers, and to bridge and open new conversations. So I do think of the book as not making any particular, this isn't a book with a particular thesis. I'm not trying to take down anyone in terms of arguments this way or that way. I'm really more interested in trying to, invigorate and inject new streams into already, very exciting conversations. So that's just sort of a background to the book. And without further delay, let me see if I can share my screen with you. Okay, so this essay is entitled Venus and the Angel of History. And it opens with an epigraph from Alice Walker's very famous essay, Looking for Zorro. And the quote is, "There are times when normal responses of grief, horror, and so on do not make sense because they bear no real relation to the depth of the emotion one feels. It was impossible for me to cry when I saw the field full of weeds where Zora is." History is something we learn. History is also a current that much of our daily life is designed to insulate us from. Even though it surges all around us, we only occasionally and often accidentally encounter its electric shock. When we do, as Walker suggests in her reflection upon discovering Zora Neale Hurston's burial ground, it often strikes our sensibility by overloading it to a point that can become dissociative, even anesthetic. We cannot register it in the same way that we would a personal emotion. The poet Nathaniel Mackey likens the experience to that of discovering a phantom limb, a numbness that points to a missing bodily member that refuses to be lost. Momentarily, in a kind of trance, we inhabit the experience of another's pain and internalize it as our own. Mackey also evocatively describes this process as a couvade, a term for sympathetic pregnancy in men, which sometimes entails a set of rituals that allow a father to accompany the birth of a child as though he were going through labor himself. These attempts to grasp the feeling of history suggest that it is the embodied learning of a vast and impersonal grief or pain of past peoples. We channel loss for persons and situations and aspirations that we have never known, an unnerving intimacy with a disremembered and dismembered past. The grain of the unknowing produces a residual irritation, the gnawing tremors of a lack that can be hard to place, one we may even loathe acknowledging, yet it refuses to go away. An instinctual desire for kinship, a gift for collective personal belonging, tells us that the things that happen to them also happen to us. They are our inalienable birthright, are about us in an important way. Sooner or later, we discover it is our time, our turn to go in search of our mother's gardens, to discover what grew there that cleared the way for us. Looking down through the generations, we see the crests of epical moments, inflection points whose visceral impact lingers in our nervous system. Think of the news of emancipation, carried across battle lines like sparks from a winter campfire in the winter of 1863. Think of Juneteenth and the cries raising up like a summer storm in the Texan heat. Think just over a century later about the news bulletins reaching folks in their homes, in their kitchens, on street corners across the land with the news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot dead by a white gunman in Memphis. In our generation, we think of election night, November 4th, 2008, the stinging of tears on the brink or already falling, the outbursts, but also the vigilant silence of old folks who explained later in faltering voices that they had to concentrate because they were not only witnessing for themselves, but also for the ancestors watching the moment through them. I remember for the second time in my life feeling that strange telescoping feeling, realizing people would be talking about and studying this very moment for hundreds of years to come. I happened to have been born in time to see the World Trade Towers fall and the first Black president rise and take his elected office. Here was another chapter in what Du Bois called, quote, the travail of souls whose burden is almost beyond the measure of their strength, but who bear it in the name of an historic race. In the roar of the crowds and in the flowing tears, you could feel it. The awesome shudder of history when it is being made, when it suddenly reaches out and shoves you in the chest, daring you not to react, daring you not to make yourself humble before it. At such moments, we know we are part of an epic, that time is not empty but pregnant with narrative orientation and disorientation. What are we to make of this epic memory, its haunting and terrorizing eruptions? Who can hold in their mind all at once the seemingly endless disasters, losses, defeats, and almost unspeakable degradations cataloged therein? The fondness of Black parents for Old Testament names is surely one way of inscribing and transmitting a response of prophetic hope across time. The tradition's spiraling return to Black Zionism, to utopian imaginations of Black statehood and Black arcs of deliverance, the fundamentally theological bent of African American politics is surely another. But hope and deliverance are only one side of the coin. The other is a fatalistic and bewildering attempt to make sense of the fear of the irredeemable, of wasted life, of brutality without compensation, of denigration and dissolution beyond account, without analog, incapable of repair. Black intellectual history has always been in part an effort to come to terms with a terrifying sense of wholesale abjection. Black life in this country has always been predicated upon and inextricably bound up with negligence, casual violence, and dishonorable death. There it is in the very first sentence of the preamble to David Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Having traveled over a considerable portion of these United States, and having in the course of my travels taken the most accurate observations of things as they exist, the result of my observations has warranted the full and unshaken conviction that we, colored people of these United States, are the most degraded, wretched, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began. And I pray God that none like us ever may live again until time shall be no more. The signs change, but a pall of negativity connects this appraisal of abjection in David Walker to sorrow in W.B. Du Bois, bleakness in Richard Wright, and one could add today subjection in Saidiya Hartman, and an Afro-pessimism, which has flourished ironically enough in the shadow of the Obama presidency. Stephen Best has lately diagnosed what he views as the malady of the omnipresence of history in our politics, a via negativa, committed to, quote, the thesis that Black identity is uniquely grounded in slavery and Middle Passage, and that, quote, what makes Black people Black is their continued navigation of an afterlife of slavery, recursions of slavery and Jim Crow, for which no one appears able to find the exit. Best raises a valid question. Does the past, however traumatic, however generative, however needful, ultimately determine the horizon of our belonging? Can it tell us who we are now at this moment and orient us toward the future? Does the shadow of disaster ever finally recede, cease to have the pull on us that perhaps it once had? If these questions seem unanswered or unanswerable, we might nevertheless ask, what accounts for the renewed intensity and urgency of these questions here and now in the first decades of the 21st century? Why, at a time when reasonable arguments can be made that things are looking better than ever, a pragmatic and empirically defensible position, does there seem to be a renewed desire to look back instead of forward? Why this enormous reluctance to relinquish the past? Why, indeed, the countervailing force in recent decades of a desperate and furious need to prevent the memory of slavery and subjection from slipping away? No thinker has addressed the contradictions of history, its shock and numbness, its pregnancies of meaning and miscarriages of justice, its hold over us and its ever-receding wake as incisively and creatively as Saidiya Hartman. In her three major works thus far, Scenes of Subjection, Lose Your Mother, and Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, the most vulnerable human beings of all, the young Black girl, appears everywhere as the plaything of history's imagination. As Hartman puts it in her celebrated essay, Venus in Two Acts, quote, variously named Harriet, Phoeba, Sarah, Joanna, Rachel, Linda, and Sally, she is found everywhere in the Atlantic world. The barracoon, the hollow of the slave ship, the pest house, the brothel, the cage, the surgeon's laboratory, the prison, the cane field, the kitchen, the master's bedroom turn out to be exactly the same place. And in all of them, she is called Venus. She is also infamously Sarah Bartman, a Khoikhoi woman who was paraded through Europe as the Venus Hottentot, her anatomy studied by their leading scientific minds. Robin Cost Lewis catalogs her many variants in her poem, Voyage of the Sable Venus. In this way, the real life of Venus is stolen twice over. This is what Hartman calls the scandal of the archive. Its Janus-faced role in granting, while simultaneously denying us the recovery of the few traces of the past that we have. The archive is, in this case, Hartman says, a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history. And yet the four opening words of Beautiful Experiments, her most recent and most exciting work, plunge us back into a paradoxical hope. You can find her. Who is she? The answer is both singular and plural, soloist and chorus. She is the countless individual lives of young Black women, many of them only retrievable through the case files compiled by New York's Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where they so often were interned. She is, for instance, 15-year-old Maddie Nelson, who came north in the years of the first Great Migration between 1890 and 1935, in search of work and ways of life she would have to imagine, since no possibility of them for her had ever previously existed. Hartman's subject is, quote, not the story of one girl, but a serial biography of a generation, a portrait of the chorus, a moving picture of the wayward. That generation's search for a new freedom collided with the most regressive and terrifying combination of science, technology, and racist ideology ever openly concocted, a period the historian Rayford Logan describes as the nadir of race relations in US history. Forced sterilizations of Black women and girls as young as 12, as Shatima Threadcraft has shown, were common enough in the South to be referred to as, quote, a Mississippi appendectomy, and would be carried on until at least 1973, when the case of Minnie Lee and her sister Mary Alice Relf eventually brought landmark legal action against sterilization abuse in 1977. It has been all too easy for some Americans to forget places in the North, with names like the Laboratory for Social Hygiene, which operated at Bedford Hills, or the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, where charming fellows like Harry Laughlin and Charles Davenport developed a racial eugenics program with policy recommendations so repulsive that the German Nazi state borrowed it as a template for the war against their own undesirables, the disabled, the feeble-minded, the Jews. Race science, social hygiene, and especially the dubious science of criminology were used to tar Black migrant populations fleeing terror, expropriation, and debt peonage in the South. These same tactics were then used to distinguish them from the European immigrant populations flooding into the country at the same time, an insidious statistical legerdemain that Khalil Muhammad has scrutinized in the condemnation of Blackness. Hartman's hesitant first-person presence within her narrative is intensely reminiscent of W.G. Sebald, that unnerving alloy of fiction and nonfiction, the melancholic mannerisms of someone sifting through debris, speculating in an ex post facto rumination upon the meaning of photographs, objects, and the personal details of minor lives, reconstructing not the scene, but everything in the wings of a historical crime. We have not always wanted to look at these lives or known how to see them. This is true of the wayward who came north in pursuit of happiness, who have been so anonymous and treated so indifferently by historians past. But it is also true of famous figures, especially some of the more famous men of this era, whom we discover in an entirely new light. Hartman undoes the erasure of these lives by allowing them to interanimate each other, to reach out to each other across the gaps. They form lists on the page, which are also chorus lines. Quote, muses, drudges, washerwomen, whores, houseworkers, factory girls, waitresses, and aspiring never to be stars. They embrace, and in turn, Hartman embraces them. In her book, they are people again. They can be themselves instead of the data that someone else's file needed them to be. Hartman is clear about the disillusionment and hurdles these women faced, but she also sees how their collective action and reckless aspiration point, quote, toward what awaits us, what is yet to come into view, what they anticipate, the time and place better than here. We should not forget that it is the very openness to futurity and incompleteness of history that makes Hartman's acts of redress possible. The cultural historian Carolyn Steedman captures this well in Dust, her brilliant study of the many uses of the archive. The writing of history, Steedman points out, quote, actually moves forward through the implicit understanding that things are not over, that the story isn't finished, can't ever be completed, for some new item of information may alter the account as it has been given. This leads to the rather startling, if retrospectively obvious, conclusion that, quote, all historians, even the most purblind empiricists, recognize this in their writing. They are telling the only story that has no end. The only story that has no end. This means that history has no conclusion that includes the writer of that history in it. But this also means that the writer of history is actively shaping the nature of this past, which has unfinished business with us, if only in its perpetual demand that we improve the quality of its transmission. Hartman has changed how we will henceforth think about the lives of Black women during a historical period we thought we knew fairly well. She has changed the past precisely because that past is not over for her, or indeed for us. Our contemporary sense of the past as a site in need of a rescue mission can be traced to Walter Benjamin. Why did his theory emerge when it did and as it did? The apocalyptic terror of the 1930s is no longer, to use a term he quite liked, quite knowable to us. For thinkers in the wealthiest nations today, it is exceedingly rare for work to be produced under threat of imminent political assassination or incarceration. Indeed, the jailing and killing of poets and philosophers, from Lorca to Denis Brutus, such a hallmark of the 20th century, has declined remarkably since the end of the Cold War. Benjamin's Über den Begriff der Geschichte, or theses on the concept of history, however, was forged in despair, a series of fragments written shortly before his death by suicide at the Spanish border as he was attempting to escape Nazi-occupied France. One of the last things Benjamin did before fleeing was to give a Paul Klee painting he owned called Angelus Novus to the writer Georges Bataille to pass on for safekeeping to his dear friend and intellectual comrade Gershom Scholem, who kept the painting in Jerusalem. In the Theses, Benjamin famously describes this painting in mystical terms. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. For Benjamin, the horror of our historical trajectory lies in the angel's inability to close his wings. What prevents that closure is the insistent storm of progress, the stubborn belief of liberals, fascists, and communists alike that technology and rational control are positive forces that merely have to be harnessed to their respective utopian projects. The political ideology of the modern world, the storm pushing to reach the paradise of modernity's impossible utopias, is in fact violent, Benjamin thinks, precisely because it cannot or will not make that which is truly valuable in the past whole and tangible to the present. The powerful may monumentalize historical icons in order to glorify the state, but this is merely in order to further cement the belief that they are legitimately carrying us all forward into a better future. What they will not permit is any chance for the wretched, for those suffering at the base of the social pyramid, to come to know the past that is really relevant to them. The artist, writer, and revolutionary anarchist's task is therefore to find a way to make the angel's wings beat again, to grant it the hummingbird's momentum, to still the storm by making something unthinkable happen. This requires the walloping force of a memory's abrupt return, like the whiplash of remembering something crucial at the last minute, an event or a revelation that will jolt the entire system off its foundations and allow the stage of history to reset with open parameters. A terrifying and also ecstatically joyful moment when everything is suddenly possible and the entire social order is thrown into the void of a new beginning. In other words, a revolution. In Benjamin's messianic vision, the only way to save the future is by rescuing the past from the overlords of the present, by fighting against those forces around us that refuse to let the buried rise, to let the ghostly voices be heard. Despite his bespectacled, aloof image, Benjamin's rage was immense, Blakean in spiritual intensity, and committed to active resistance. No one may ever make peace with poverty when it falls like a gigantic shadow upon his countrymen and his house, he says in One Way Street. Then he must be alert to every humiliation done to him, and so discipline himself that his suffering becomes no longer the downhill road of grief, but the rising path of revolt. Benjamin was no reformist. He was adamant that the bourgeoisie has to be completely abolished and that time is running out. Quote, before the spark reaches the dynamite, the lighted fuse must be cut, he warned. Benjamin's usefulness for the writing of critiques in the contemporary academy has muted, even eclipsed, the theopolitical intensity of this revolutionary anarchism. He has become a kind of Che Guevara for a portion of the intelligentsia that feels it must talk the talk, but cannot begin to imagine how to walk the walk. Some are embarrassed by his ardency, by his conviction that art and politics and history are one, and that getting them right is about saving the world by ending the one we know. Some grumble that his work is too cryptic, but the truth is that his writing is not hard to understand, it is hard to look at directly. His aphoristic fragments singe like solar flares. The only way of knowing a person is to love that person without hope. Who can survive that test? Who today would dare to read Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal or Blanqui's prison writings on astronomy as serious reports on the state of damnation of the modern world? Who is prepared to say that social media, AI, and robotic automation are not just the products of neoliberalism, the society of control and lack of oversight, but visions of hell? I'm not saying that Benjamin doesn't see any redemptive opportunities in culture and technology, or that our own speculations on such are not worthwhile. He does, and they are. But it is undeniable that the intellectual culture of the present has come to relish that part of Benjamin's work without committing to or taking seriously his anarchist and messianic call for a revolutionary politics. To continue in Benjamin's terms, if the intellectual classes can stroll up to the precipice, look over and decide it's not yet time to leap, then they will not be the ones to bring the light of redemption to the people. It will be contested, but I think it's fair to say that Black intellectuals, even those I respectfully disagree with, have been more willing than most to steer our way to the ledge, to hold our gaze over its edge. This makes sense since the people whose redemption we seek have the least to lose. We may be in disarray and disagreement about what to do about it, but at least Black studies takes as a premise that our society is in a terminal emergency. Yet of all the cultural forces in the social fabric, Black intellectuals also tend to have the shortest reach. We're hard to read, hard to like, hard to look at directly, sometimes hard to find at all. Black artists, however, and there is a case to be made that art is the realm of Benjamin's true legacy, are getting bolder and more far-reaching with every decade, more willing to force us to look. Consider that extraordinary appearance in 2014 of A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Babe, that modern-day sphinx that Kara Walker raised inside the cavernous belly of the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn. The art critic Roberta Smith singled out this installation as easily the most significant work of art produced in the last decade, a period which stood out to her as a new moment of arrival for Black artists and Black art. The road to this historic commission began back in the early 1990s, when Kara Walker, then a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, began to rethink her relationship to race and representation in her artwork. Walker grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and her father, a painter, taught at Georgia State University. Her first years as a young art student were spent at the Atlanta College of Art, where Walker initially conceived of becoming a painter like her father. Against the trends in the art world, she was interested in figural painting and devoted herself to studying the techniques of the old masters of European art. But by the end of her MFA at RISD, Walker had made a radical swerve. In her first major show in 1994, she demonstrated an approach she would rework throughout the rest of the decade, based on the silhouette effect of cutouts using black and white paper. Jettisoning the frame of the individual painting, she became in effect a muralist, transforming the default white space of gallery walls from a neutral institutional background into a surface of psychic and phantasmagorical projection, like the cycloramas of the late 19th century. These works implicitly returned gallery viewers to the position of the leisured spectators of the age of minstrelsy, that antebellum brew of racial masquerade and humiliation, which formed the original grease that has lubricated America's cultural industry. The figures in Walker's cutouts are a Rabelaisian parade of stock characters from the American racial commedia. Darkies, mammies, coons, pickaninnies, sambos, tar babies, jigaboos. Like the witty horror in Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, or the trashy fantasies of Bubbles Brazil, the white heroine of Darius James's 1992 novel Negrophobia. Their force is due largely to the legibility that we, the viewers, supply to an otherwise surreal script before us. What's so disturbing in the vignettes is precisely that we recognize them, that the source of those racial scripts is not Walker's polarized abstractions, but our own heads. It is sufficiently baked into our miscegenated American DNA that younger viewers can recognize the characters, even without having seen Gone with the Wind, read Uncle Tom's Cabin, or listened to Amos and Andy. In a powerful essay on Walker entitled, "What Do We Want History to Do to Us?" Zadie Smith focuses on this iconoclastic quality in Walker's work, holding it up as a beacon, quote, for Black freedom of expression itself. For Smith, Walker lays down a fierce example of what can be achieved when an artist refuses to reduce herself to what others demand, the role they believe you ought to play instead of the one you feel to be true. Quote, "I hope Walker is never ashamed to be the wrong kind of artist, woman, Black person, or ever exhausted by our endless projections upon her." Smith is right to insist on the refusal of those twinned impulses so acutely characteristic of our public discourse, shame and outrage. One gift an artist might give to other artists, Smith observes, is a demonstration of how to make work without shame. This is very true. Another gift, or perhaps the other side of this gift, is to help those of us experiencing art to learn the virtues of a more delicate reaction, one no less necessary or valuable, the capacity for embarrassment. I'm surprised at how little this word comes up in relation to Walker's work. Can I be the only person who feels embarrassed in its presence? Regardless of the racial composition of the group, even in the event, however less likely, that one is solely in the presence of Black visitors, encountering a piece by Kara Walker seems to me inherently embarrassing. There's no way not to be discomfited by its presence. Any commentary on the work is immediately fraught. The evasion of such commentary with small talk is even more so. What we ought to do is laugh. As Glenda Carpio has noted, laughter and humor are essential to Walker's work, though just how much and exactly at what one is laughing are the rub. Is the joke on us? On only some of us? Is the antebellum negress, who speaks so archly in the mischievous title cards to her works, a merry trickster? Tavia Nyong'o makes a persuasive case that there is a kind of art world trolling at play in Walker's work that may not always evade the complicities she involves herself in through its commercialization. Her sugar baby, he points out, was erected in a portion of rapidly gentrifying Brooklyn and ended up effectively doing public relations work for the corporations and real estate companies behind that gentrification. Even if Walker were fully aware of that and slyly giving them something they might not have found quite to taste, the ultimate outcome is still arguably a big check for her and a checklist item ticked off for the Vornado real estate magnates seeking to woo the creative class into their glass condo towers. I don't deny that there are important and possibly irresolvable questions about complicity between art and capital, but that does not necessarily negate or immediately annul the potential effects of the work upon those who saw it, or those who will at least know that it was possible to make such a work and raise it in that time and place. Walker has made it clear that she is interested in how people interact with her work. Fortunately, there is a record of the public's reaction to the installation. She had her team videotape the reactions of visitors as they walked through the ruins of the domino factory. Walker said that she was especially interested in the reaction of Black visitors, those alone, those in couples, entire families that made the pilgrimage. What is responsible for the tremor, the shimmering strangeness, and discomposure in the searching gazes they cast upon the subtlety, all those bashful deflection, exposure of intimate knowledge? Is art really at bottom a vehicle for communing around our shared embarrassments? What, for instance, is the appropriate response to turning the corner at the rear of the factory and having the sugar baby's vulva come into view? I see a wink back to Walker's early art school days, a memory of Courbet's scandalous L'Origine du Monde, a painting that gazes frontally into the sex of a white woman and names her original. In addition to correcting Courbet from an anthropological point of view, Walker restores a historical and material sense to the world. Her installation is very purposefully made of the most profitable of the slave crops of the Americas, harvested on an industrial scale at exorbitant cost of African blood, and amassing great fortunes whose capital flowed through the commercial veins of the city at the mouth of the Hudson, where the domino factory once churned out its highly lucrative and addictive product. What is supremely profitable today is contemporary art. How profitable? In 2019, a work called Rabbit by the artist Jeff Koons sold at auction for $91 million, setting a new record for a living artist. Walker's work fetches hefty sums too, yet aesthetically and more important ethically, I think they are radically and even diametrically opposed. Still, they are worth pondering together, Walker's subtlety and Koons's Rabbit, because they stand before us like signs at a fork in the road, indicating the options ahead. Both are signatures of contemporary Americana. Neither could have been produced anywhere other than in the USA. Both express in remarkably accurate terms an ugliness unique to our culture. Walker's art tells us more than we want to hear about the ugliness of our past. Koons's Silver Bunny shows us the ugliness of our present, and if we do nothing to alter its course, the ugly emptiness of our future. By polishing away any possible connection to the past and glibly seeking succor in false innocence and false universality, Koons has produced perhaps the whitest art, ideologically, not ethnically, ever created. Even the white bourgeoisie no longer finds its shock value palatable. In a scathing review some years ago, Jed Pearl called a Koons retrospective, quote, a multi-million-dollar mausoleum in which everything that was ever lively and challenging about avant-gardism and Dada and Duchamp has gone to die. There is no real laughter, no genuine embarrassment to be had in the presence of a Koons. Irritation, indifference, transient fascination, titillation, maybe, but never embarrassment. How could you be embarrassed? Koons, not unlike Donald Trump, is a pure troll, one who sees that in a society obsessed with shaming, the ultimate sign of freedom, superiority, and success is shamelessness tout court, and it sells itself. It is the triumph of pure appearance, the art and politics of a deathless, lifeless, narrative-free future. Whether it is capital's concentration and colonization of our private lives, or some other force at work, there is mounting evidence that as a society, we are increasingly and collectively fetishizing shame, while losing our responsive capacity as individuals for embarrassment. But the ability to acknowledge embarrassment is a precious resource, and one deeply related to creativity, to the creative act, whether artistic or political. When cultivated in a poet like Keats, as Christopher Ricks famously argued, embarrassment can lay the foundation for that essential quality of negative capability. Moments of hesitation that extend the pursuit of thought beyond the accepted frame of our certainties. We think of such qualities as important for poetic thinking, but they can be no less necessary to political and social problems, and maybe more so. Whatever one thinks of the sugar baby, she is undeniably subtle in ways that Kunz's rabbit is not. She makes us uncomfortable and arouses emotions that his work cannot access or perhaps even remember once existed. The sugar baby signifies effortlessly, not in spite of her faults, but because of them, including her awkward entanglements in the art commodity market. She is full, even inflated, with embarrassing memories that stir in us as we come into her space. There is a pastness and something very present that radiates from her surreal presence. She is, at the very least, one way of envisioning the angel of history. The angel is not only Benjamin's or Paul Clay's. We have to be on the lookout for her. We have to take notice and speak up when she passes by. She may come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. She often will not, and probably should not, seek to present herself in ways that will necessarily make us comfortable. But in the last instance, isn't it our mothers that make us feel the most important kind of embarrassment of all? The one that makes us want to do better and be better. Not out of shame, but because we know in their sight that we really are better. If this is true, then letting ourselves dwell in embarrassment before our own history, to laugh productively at ourselves and with each other, is not a sign of hopelessness. It is a mark of vitality, a living current that only awaits our full acknowledgement and our willingness to be uncomfortable together a little longer than we usually allow. When I say that the sugar baby is the angel of history, this doesn't require that the artwork itself be resisted, or that the artist who made her be the agent of our progress and our salvation. The angel or the sugar baby is no better than the rest of us, helplessly being pushed by the forces of progress and its accumulated disasters into the future. What makes her different is that she emerges as a towering work that looms for us to see, to look up from our daily routines and interrupt them, if only for the space of a visit. If we can do that, we might begin to notice, like the way Walker's Sphinx speaks to us of Langston Hughes's lines about those rivers, ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. Or Zora Neale Hurston's line about how the nigger woman is the mule of the world. And what Saidiya Hartman tells us about mothers. Quote, the slave ship is a womb, an abyss. The plantation is the belly of the world. This is the world that the sugar baby looks back upon, the world made by the Black woman, the one that tells the truth of our past, even when we'd rather not hear it like that. She is also the one who makes possible the work still to be done. Without my mother's legacy, Jesmyn Ward writes in her searing memoir, Men We Reaped, I would never have been able to look at this history of loss, this future where I will surely lose more, and write the narrative that remembers. What riddles does the Sphinx tell? Does her behind, which might embarrass us upon first discovering it, upon further reflection, inform us that it too deserves greater respect than we have generally accorded it? Or is what matters most of all the direction she's looking in, backward, into the past, that made her what she is. Thank you. We'll end it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse, for that that incredible talk. Yeah. So we have, I mean, we're here for questions and conversation. I know some people may need to duck out there, but hopefully we can keep the conversation going. If you have a question, you can use the hand raise function in reactions or post in the chat. I recognize it may be, everyone may want to sit with that for a moment and formulate any questions they might have. And I have a ton of questions myself, thinking about the book. I've been sitting with it and looking at it for the last week. And so some of my questions are, they range more broadly than this particular essay that people saw tonight. But I think I might be able to, my big question, or maybe my introductory question, I think I can connect it to some degree. Talking about Walter Benjamin and this moment, writing the theses of history, sort of thinking of them, at this precipitous moment as he's, fleeing into Spain, and this sense of the past and the present, and in some sense the present threatening the past, right? I'm wondering, so I know you're, I guess, thinking about like the connection between art and global politics, right? And I'm thinking about your dissertation work on Black culture in the Cold War, and looking at thinking about some of your essays. You have a really moving essay in this book on the Bataclan massacre in killing in Paris, the ISIS shooting, and you also in Notes on Trap, and repeatedly you talk about the connection between different things, but in Notes on Trap you specifically look at the connection between trap music and the global war on terror, right? You write, trap indexes the fever dreams of a declining imperial power. It erupts within a wounded unconscious, seeking scapegoats, and so on and so on. The frustrations and failures of military adventurism on the frontiers and borderlands are internalized. They find sites for expression in the fractured, neglected wastelands at the periphery of the power capital, in the ghetto, the hood, the slums, the bricks, the barrio, the mud, the bando, the trap house. I wanted to invite you, and I apologize for the long preface to this question. I want to invite you to talk about climate change. In climate change as a global event, and climate change and all its ramifications, and what relation it might have to African-American culture, Black culture in the US at present. Just thinking about the effect of Katrina and the subsequent disasters, and the emergence of, you talk about, you have a great essay on Afro-pessimism in here, the emergence of Afro-pessimism in this moment. It's something I think about. So I wanted to invite you to open up on that.
No, I hear you. You want me to talk about apocalypse, and I hear you loud and clear. It's worth no. I mean that seriously. Like I think that and in a sense, the piece that I just read invites that as well. Let me say this, just to jump momentarily from this particular essay. And to me, there are sort of zigzag paths through, from all the pieces, from one to the other. But, I'm taking Jeff Koons to task here, but in a sense, to me, he represents an entire mentality that's not restricted to him as one particular artist. In a sense, you have there a kind of pure image of decadence, a concentration of fetishization of the commodity, and frankly, a conception of art which has been sapped of all of the things that actually make art relevant to human beings. That's who want a nice investment vehicle or something like that. And that process, the fact that the reason I point to it is that it exists, and the fact that it exists tells us something about the society, about our society's trajectory, and how dangerous that trajectory is if we don't do something fundamentally to alter it. And the current administration has just announced that we're going to finally draw out of Afghanistan, and you still have people like I think it was Brett Stevens in the New York Times writing op-eds saying no, we need to continue. Why are we pulling out? We spent $2 trillion in Afghanistan. When one thinks about what $2 trillion spent instead on fixing American health, fixing American education, actually creating a culture of life-affirming, a life-affirming society here at home, you see the gravity of the stakes of this kind of maniacal, monomaniacal, warmongering and capitalistic project. It's absolutely devastating, and it does have immediate and serious implications that reverberate in our cultural life. And part of what I wanted to do in Notes on Trap is to get people to see that this cultural form, which I myself came to in a kind of awkward way, because I'm really someone who was more of like a 90s hip hop head. And I found myself, when trap really started bubbling up, I found myself in this awkward position of, sounding like the old folks, like my parents or something, like, oh, what is this? This mumblecore, like they don't respect lyrics like we used to back in the day. Stuff really had, message. What is this? And so I had to, but I wanted to fight that instinct, right, in myself, to be judgmental. And instead of just to pass judgment on this art form, to ask the question of, what does it mean that it's happening? What does it mean that this is, what is it expressing about this moment that we're in? And to take it seriously. And one of the things that is one of the countless misfortunes of living in a racist society is that so much of Black cultural life and expression is not actually taken seriously. And trap music is an excellent example of this. People enjoy it. They want to, you play it at the club. You can listen to it into your car, and people of all races and backgrounds sort of enjoy it without necessarily, I think, really dwelling on the deeper significance of what's actually being articulated in that message. And we get stuck in these, to me, not very, not fruitful debates that still go back to the politics of respectability. Oh man, is this setting us back as a people? These are bad representations of us. They're twerking. What are we going to do? Instead of asking the question, like, how is the ideology of this music resonant, for example, with the ideology of Wall Street? Right? I mean, these people have essentially the same ethic and in some ways operate on the same wavelength, and that's telling. Right? What is the connection between the kind of militarism and embrace of violence abroad by the empire and the embrace of militarism and the concentration of violence domestically, in that we see all around us, the gun violence, et cetera? These things are not, in fact, divorced from each other. They're intimately interrelated, and they interanimate each other. For example, in the disinvestment that I just referred to.
Right.
So, one of the things that, Black intellectuals you can go back, all the way to Du Bois and beyond have been grappling with this problem, but I think it's a deeply fascinating one, is that we've for a very long time understood that Black culture, in the matrix of the United States as a state, and as now, in a sense, as the world hegemon and as an imperial power,
right,
plays this extraordinary role that really fundamentally resembles what Derrida calls the pharmacon. That is to say, it is always simultaneously the cure and the poison. So everything, American capital runs on Black culture. I always say to people, Nike wouldn't have been anything without Jordan. And so we're constantly helping capital to slide forward. We're constantly co-opted and recycled and brought back into a system that uses the vitality of that culture to reproduce capitalism, and in some ways to make it even more effective. And yet at the same time, that very same cultural energy and force is always disruptive, is always a little bit too much, is always a little bit excessive, is always a little bit disruptive, and in fact is the force that is simultaneously helping capital to reproduce itself, but also preventing the U.S. state from fully, completely closing down on some of its worst underlying ideological foundations. Among them, the desire that has always existed in the United States for it to be, at a minimum, a kind of South African style apartheid state. And of course, it's in many founding levels, a white supremacist state. And of course, there are folks who still, would like to, America to once again become a white ethno state. Unfortunately, it's too late for them. It was too late quite a long time ago. But the fact of the matter is that doesn't mean that there aren't forces that are always pushing in that direction. And it's precisely, and I have to say, to some extent, uniquely, not uniquely because we're the only ones who are subject to the forces or the only ones who resist, but because we have this unique dialectical position within the history, right, of the country, that it's precisely Black culture that is constantly preventing the United States from becoming a white ethno state, or in preventing the systems from completely strangulating any possibility for a kind of more democratic, more egalitarian, more humanistic future. But it is also, as per trap music, a bit of a trap. We're stuck in this thing where we're simultaneously, as I said, the pharmacon, we're simultaneously the thing that is, turning the screw, even further, and yet somehow also disrupting it. And, you asked about climate change. Well,
yeah,
one of the things I would say about that is that if you believe that problems of that order and magnitude have to be solved, at least at a minimum, with some kind of democratic mandate, that's to say, they can't simply be imposed technocratically by a few billionaires at the top who come up with some fanciful idea for what to do about it, but actually that kind of change would come from a democratic majoritarian group of people coming together and saying, no, like, we love this planet. We understand there's a grave problem. We need to lock arms together and do something about it. That kind of solidarity, the thing that has always prevented broad, thick, meaningful solidarities of that type in the United States is, of course, racism, which has always been used by the ruling class in the United States of America to break the possibility of that solidarity, going back to the colonial era, precisely because they feared the challenge to capital that a united democratic bottom of the society would have. And so, I would, to people who are interested and deeply invested in those ecological questions and the questions of climate change, I would say to them, of course, those are enormously important. What I would say is that you're never going to even begin to be able to address those questions seriously in a democratic fashion without first getting through doing something about the problem of the racial impasse that we have in our politics. And so, insofar as we have tools at our disposal that we've created as within our own history and our culture, look to Black culture, look to Black arts, look to Black thinkers, and take them seriously. Read their works, because there are answers there for how to move forward. And unfortunately, I don't think, even though, of course, things are slightly more integrated than they were in the past, I still think that in large measure, our intellectual elites do not take Black thinkers seriously, not seriously enough. They do not take Black artists seriously enough. They do not take Black culture seriously enough. But sooner or later, they will have to, because that is the way forward, at least in my view.
Great, thank you. I've got follow-ups on that, but I want to make room for other folks. Mark Sanders, you have your hand up.
Well, Roy, I don't know. Do we have time? I mean, I have a question, but I don't want to belabor things. Professor McCarthy, thank you so much. I first wanted to say thank you for your book. I opened it in anticipation of this lecture, and the first essay on Foucault and Diego Velázquez and his enslaved Black Juan de Pareja, I just thought was absolutely brilliant. It just absolutely blew me away. It just so happened that a few days before I got to about the middle of your book, I was teaching Invisible Man, and I did a section on the blues as such, and the way in which the blues is the kind of basis for American popular culture, and whatever music students are listening to, it has some kind of blues base. And then literally that night, I read the essay on French hip hop, where you actually quote Ellison's definition of the blues from his review of Richard Wright's Black Boy. And I had just read that definition in my class. And so I brought your book back to my class and read that entire paragraph about hip hop and the way in which, as you say, shit happens and you just have to deal with it. And that's the essence of the blues. I just thought that was wonderful. And then what you were just saying and what Roy was just reading in terms of trap, that helped me to understand what my son hears in Pop Smoke or Little Uzi Vert or Young Thug, things that I really can't, but that your framing really helped me to understand more profoundly. So I just wanted to thank you for all of that. The question that I'm kind of winding up to, in a way you've just answered in that very eloquent response to Roy, it seems to me that the book, on the one hand, is really quite hopeful about the power of culture in just this way that you just talked about, with the power of African-American culture and the power of a longer tradition of African-American intellectual work. And at the same time, really quite pessimistic about the possibilities of a bourgeois democracy. And so my question really was, how do you reconcile the two? And to my sense of what you just said, there is no reconciliation, but please say more if you have more to say.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that. I mean, it's extremely moving to hear someone say something like that, because in a lot of ways, you write this stuff and you want, yeah, I don't know if it even makes sense, and you never really know like how people are going to respond and how people are going to understand it. But to me, the most important thing is ultimately that like that the work be useful, that it actually make it, find some kind of utility in people's lives. And it's very moving to me to hear that. So thank you for sharing that. The question you're posing is a really important one. And in some ways, I think it resurfaces again and again, throughout the book and in almost all of the essays in one form or another. And I think, one of the things that I'm particularly I think, invested in is trying to think about, on the one hand, being serious, being forthright, not being naive, not being one of these, in other words, not being someone who is coming to the public square and once again just saying to everybody, hey, be hopeful, a better future, is out there, just hang in there, we just have to, so and I understand the critique of that. Ta-Nehisi Coates has made an important critique of that. Frank Wilderson and even Saidiya Hartman and various others who are affiliated in one form or fashion or another with Afro-pessimism, make really important critiques of that kind of intellectual kind of maneuver or posture. At the same time, I am deeply, deeply convinced that sometimes, I teach in a department which is itself this kind of, bricolaged, department, which reflects the complexities and the difficulties of the very subject that we teach, right? So it's the Department of African and African American Studies, because prior to this, there was a Department of African Studies, which is its own thing. There's a Department of African American Studies, they were merged. And, I am very conscious about sort of the risks of exceptionalizing the African American situation. And indeed, if you read the very last essay, Harlem is Everywhere, which is a riff on Ellison's essay, Harlem is Nowhere, of course, but in important ways is about the ways in which the culture is moving, I think, into this greater, diasporic consciousness, one that, Paul Gilroy, I think very presciently traced for us in the Black Atlantic, but which I think we're really beginning to actually hear as this younger generation of African artists who've been raised on African American, popular hip hop and so on and so forth are kind of merging, and it's all happening. And what Harlem to me is now is yes, on the one hand, this kind of this complicated gentrification about which there's a lot to regret, though not everything, but also at the same time, this a Black capital that's in some ways as and perhaps more African now than it is African American, which is really exciting to me, at least, and fascinating. So I'm wary of all of these things, but I will say that, I think with all of that being said, and one of the reasons I'm always coming back to David Walker is really like a important figure for my thinking. I think that for better or for worse, the way that history has taken its course has made the United States a kind of unique world power. And especially, once you get into the post-45 era and you have this kind of superpower global dominance, and we're still, people talk about multipolarity and this and that, but the fact of the matter is that, this is Rome. This is literally the empire. And that means that, when you bend the trajectory of the history here, you're bending the trajectory of world history. Now, what happens in a case in Minnesota, what happens to George Floyd has global reverberations in ways that things that happen elsewhere were horrible cases of police brutality, incredibly similar down to the positions of officers in Brazil, but they haven't had this kind of global resonance. And we know, of course, there are many those kinds of things happen in Africa. Those kinds of things happen in so many places, but here they immediately suddenly have this massive reverberation. Why is that? And what does that say about the position of African American culture? Why is it, as I say in my essay Back on the Day, which you were alluding to, that this generation of North Africans, kids from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Senegal, and Guinea, growing up in the projects in Paris, immediately identify with Tupac, immediately identify with this music that doesn't have an immediate, connection to them. And I think the reason is that, the fact that, African Americans as a people went through slavery under the conditions of modernity. Many peoples have undergone through slavery, but under the conditions of capitalistic modernity, right? And came out of it into our present era with this immediate and unbroken living tradition. People hear in that a force. They respond to something that it was encoded into that culture and into its artistic and creative expressions, because for those people, as a people undergoing those things, right, music, wasn't just entertainment. This was survival, right? This was ontological, to use the term that we love, these days in the academy. And I think people of all backgrounds, even if they don't understand it, and often they don't understand it, they can feel it. They're responding to it, and it has an extraordinary power. Now, that same potential and that power is endlessly also useful and can be recuperated by capital, and it constantly is. And as I say, we're deeply bound up and constantly, co-opted by American capitalism. But I do think that the reason I insist upon this is because it's not just about being kind of optimistic about culture in the face of the fact that things look really terrible. It's saying, if you take a certain kind of analytical rigor, a serious historicism, and also a kind of serious thinking about the meaning of art and what it does for people and to people, then I think you will come to the conclusion, you will see that this development, what Du Bois called the development of a world historical people, has extraordinary implications that are, in a sense, inevitable. So we can, I'm not, that doesn't mean we see it in our lifetimes, and it's not about just naively selling people this notion of hope, but I feel completely confident in saying that, this is, and it's what, Baldwin said, and Richard Wright said also, the Negro is the metaphor of America. What happens to us, our condition, it's going to reflect the condition for everybody. What the trap artists are talking about, even though it's highly concentrated, that violence and that despair is highly concentrated in the Black community, it's not exclusive to it anymore. You see what's happening with the devastation in poor white communities, the way the drugs now are through them and all of this. This is going to, in other words, there is that kind of bellwether quality, and all the, so that it's always, to me, we can debate endlessly about it, but the terms of the future are being written right there. And so why would we not go there to pay attention, to listen, to try and understand, and hopefully to extract the right lessons to help us at least get on the right track. I don't know if we'll get there, but we could at least try and get on the right track. We know for damn sure we're not on the right track right now.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. What you're saying is so powerful, and I'm not going to go back to my previous question, but I do want to say, last spring, right? I mean, the way the future is being written in these places that you talk about. Last spring, when at about this time of year, as coronavirus was exploding around the country, I watched Spike Lee's When the Levees Broke about Katrina, and it was heartrending on so many levels. It was heartrending to go back to that event, and to go back to the human tragedy and the egregious. I have to stop myself from swearing. The state failure in that case, just outright blatant, I mean, Kanye West's message to President Bush was opposite at that moment, right? That President Bush doesn't care about Black people. Like, it was just like the racism there, and the economic neglect, and the like gross neoliberal disaster capitalism, all of it. And it was happening all at the same time again with coronavirus, with the COVID-19 epidemic. Just all the same things, like just neglect and like obstruction and not showing up, and like it was just it just so and so again, I was just like, how do we change the script? There's a question from Patrick McMonagle, but he appears to have
I see that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he seems gone. I think he left. So I will actually you could feel free to answer Patrick's question, but Francisco has his hand up. I would tend to privilege the questions of the people who are still here. So
Hi, it's great to see you. Brandon says hello as well. This is a great talk. So one of the questions I had was, I guess this is more of like a strange, like, I would say it's a little bit abstract in some way, but to get you to think about a little bit of how you're positioning yourself or posturing yourself in terms of like a worldview. Because one of the things that's so interesting is that you're offering what I think is a cosmopolitanism that isn't cosmopolitanism. Like, you wouldn't say take Kwame Appiah's point of view, but instead you take something like similar to what Walter Benjamin or Fred Moten or Sylvia Wynter or Woody Guthrie would take, like a sort of really different approach to the universal or the cosmopolitan. And I think this is something that James Baldwin, especially, when he uses big categories like truth with a capital T, which he absolutely does, but he's thinking about something a little bit different than what Appiah would call cosmopolitanism. And I actually think that your work takes this up to at the same time. And I'm thinking in particular of your critique of Wilderson, which I think is sort of hinges on this. I really don't know what to call it. Cosmopolitanism with a difference, a sort of, well, I'll just end there. But how you would maybe characterize that point of view?
It's a great question. Thanks, Francisco, for that. It's a sharp question. It's difficult. You give me the difficult question, but I'll take a stab at it. So I'm going to be careful here. I don't want to mischaracterize Appiah's cosmopolitanism. It's a richly argued position that he has. But what I'll say is that I think that in regards to some of the ways in which I take exception to the line that is taken by Wilderson and some others in Afro-pessimism, I think for me there's a problem when historical materialism and in particular class as a modality completely fall out of the picture. And I'll say this just to be perfectly clear. I think Wilderson and I think Afro-pessimism in general has made really important contributions theoretically and enriched the conversation in ways that are really important. And I'm really grateful for their work. And for example, in particular, I think that their kind of centering of anti-Blackness is something that was really needed and revealed some very powerful and painful evasions that were happening in various corners of sort of academic discourse. That being said, my issues there revolve around a number of what I consider, slippages, let's say. So, I think that their readings of Francis Fanon are questionable, often selective, at a minimum, highly debatable. And I also think that there are these kind of slippage moments where Wilderson will want to say, well, look, I'm primarily just wanting to have a conversation over here in the academy. I'm just interested in having a little kind of technical conversation about ideas. I'm like, well, yeah, but in reality, that's not how the term is circulating now. For example, it's absolutely in activist circles. It absolutely has an impact on political discourse well beyond some corner in the academy. To the extent that that's the case, I'm not blaming him for that. I'm not holding him responsible for that. I'm saying, insofar as that's the case, then it seems to me perfectly legitimate to say, well, it's worth, contesting these understandings in the public sphere, because that's where they're now circulating. It's not just a technical conversation over here in the academy. And to the extent that that view relies on a kind of, a reification, an ontological reification in their view of race, in which, as I said, the class modality completely falls out, in which you're willing to write sentences that assert that as a professor in a university, you are in the exact same position as somebody who is, slinging rock on the corner. When you are in the exact same position, and you're willing to describe yourself as a slave, and not only a slave, but a slave to your colleagues, to your white colleagues at least. When you're willing to suggest that, in a sense, this racial reification is so powerful and so overwhelming that indeed your very erection of the concept cannot be challenged, because it's not theoretical, it's meta-theoretical. All of this is suggesting to me, and I'm going to circle back here to your point about cosmopolitan. All of this is suggesting to me, right, in a way, a kind of desire for, paradoxically, a kind of return to a kind of Hegelian recognition, a kind of specialness, a special status, right? This is the problem of the ruse of analogy. I don't want to be compared to anything. I'm unique. I'm special. I have this status that cannot be compared to anyone else's status or situation. And I think that sometimes cosmopolitanism is imagined as a kind of an insistence on the superiority and specialness of the person who, by virtue of their detachment, but also their sort of it's a bland word, but their openness, makes them, more or less better in some sense than other people. They have this kind of special quality that other people should aspire to have, if only they would be a little bit more enlightened in a sense, and come around to what is the most correct view, and kind of enter into this special status. And I think that I'm rather taken with the way somebody like Fred Moten, for instance, wants to say, cosmopolitanism, to the extent that we even want to use that word, might better be thought as not as this exceptionalizing of this individual who embodies a kind of higher perspective, a more enlightened perspective, this special openness to the world that makes them stand apart from everybody else. But rather, the good cosmopolitanism, the meaningful cosmopolitanism, the one that Moten is interested in, is one that proceeds from the opposite operation, where your individuality is, in a sense, kind of stripped away. This would be, for him, what is the cosmopolitanism of the hold. So when those bodies are in the hold of the slave ship, and they've been deliberately placed so that people from different tribes are next to each other in order to prevent revolts, so that you can't communicate, right? So you have to learn to communicate with the people who are physically bound next to you and essentially, connected to you, so that you almost cease to be, your individuality is sort of dissolved in that moment, and you need to find a new language, completely new language, right, in order to communicate with the people who are around you, because you're from different ethnicities, you're from different tribes, you're from different worlds fundamentally. But what's being produced in that hold is blackness. It's New World blackness that's being produced, and it is already cosmopolitanism. In other words, it doesn't become cosmopolitanism because it considers culture to be like a sampling platter, where you're, a well-educated bourgeois and you like sushi, but you also like Mexican food and you appreciate all kinds of things equally, right? But blackness is cosmopolitan by the synthetic way in which it's forged from below. And not out of free will, right, out of free choice, but just out of necessity, right, where people just have to, get along to go along, right, where people, have, create and I think Moten is right that, what comes out of that, the culture that emerges from that kind of an experience. As I say, not the experience of a cosmopolitan who is special, who is unique, whether that uniqueness is because of their unique openness, or whether that uniqueness is a uniqueness because of their uniquely victimized status. But the culture that emerges from people who are forced to exist collectively and in collective sociality, that's the only cosmopolitanism worth having. That's the real one. That's the one that produces things that people everywhere respond to, because those things are cutting against the reification and eventually bourgeoisification of the individual, and are the products of and expressive of human beings making something together because they have to, and because when you make stuff together, it's actually pretty great. Like, we're actually pretty good at that as human beings, if we're allowed to. If we're given the opportunity to actually meet each other as human beings, it's amazing what people will do if you actually allow them. But so much of the apparatus, the repressive apparatus, the state apparatus, the enslaving apparatus, the policing apparatus, the ideological status game, which pits individuals against each other, is designed to tell you that that's not true, that you're not the same as this person, that you're special, that you're unique, that you're different, and maybe better than this other person because you have X, because you have Y. And that X or Y could be an element of your identity, or it could be something that you bought, or it could be, the fact that you live in this neighborhood and not that neighborhood, or it be that you buy this bag and not that bag, or you shop at this place and not that place. But all of that stuff is actually alienating you from the truth, which is the truth of the blues, which is that we all have exactly the same needs. At the end of the day, as human beings, you're not that different. And just because you grew up in Beverly Hills, at the end of the day, or you grew up, in the slums, at the end of the day, as a human being, your basic human needs are the same. And the things that are good, that good cooking, that good music, that good, when the party's really good, that stuff gets made together by people who know how to be together, right? And cosmopolitanism of a bourgeois type doesn't teach you how to be together like that. But cultures that were forged in that, they know about being together. And, I think part of what Black culture and expressive life has done in an American context in which there's an enormous amount of violence connected to, this kind of horrific Lockean liberal capitalism, which locks everyone into the pursuit of their happiness as individuals, is to remind people that happiness, in the Declaration, the only true way to actually have it, to actually enjoy it, is with others, with people. It's not your individual pursuit. Your individual pursuit is always at the expense of somebody else's, right? But they're not going to tell you that. But if you listen to Black music, you might hear a different story. I'll just say, I'll put it that way.
Phenomenal. Ending. And I can't think of a better, I don't know if there are other questions out there, but we're a little over time. I can't think of a more hopeful note to end on than that. I don't know. I want to thank you, Jesse, for coming to talk with us and sharing your work. Thank everyone for their questions. And thank you for your really your deeply thoughtful answers to the questions we had. It's a real it's an honor and a pleasure to have spent this time together. I don't know what we've made, but I hope it's an ongoing part of an ongoing conversation and a project. And I do want to talk with you more about climate change at some point, not apocalypse, but I don't know. Thank you. Let's have a round of.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to everyone. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Mark. And thanks to everyone else. Really appreciate it. It was great talking.
All right. Let's keep in touch, and you have a good night. Digital applause all around.